name is Ajit Subramaniam. I'm an oceanographer at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University. The daily life of an oceanographer, an observational oceanographer, is we go out to sea on research ships. The ships can vary in size. Just as an example, the ship that I went out on my last major oceanographic expedition was a German research vessel that's about 100 meters in length and can accommodate about 80 people. We left out of Cape Town, South Africa. So just as an example to show you on this globe here, we left out of Cape Town, South Africa, and that is about there, went up the coast of South Africa to the equator, and then ran the equator all the way to the coast of South America, and then went back to Cape Verde, which is off the coast of northern West Africa. The whole voyage took about 55 days. And a typical day basically would involve putting instruments into the water, getting water samples, processing them, going to the next location. We were stopping every 6 hours. We were basically sampling every degree of latitude, which is every 60 nautical miles. The ship goes at 10 miles an hour. So basically we were stopping every 6 hours, which means you don't get to sleep that much. The reason for this cruise, this expedition, we call them cruises, which is something that's going to slip out of my mouth occasionally, even as I try to keep with more formal terms. The reason for this expedition was we were trying to understand how the equatorial Atlantic works. There are many processes that basically contribute to productivity of a single cell plant, which is basically what I study, called phytoplankton. These single cell plants basically can do photosynthesis, which means they take up CO2 from the atmosphere and form the basis of the food web, which essentially is their food for fish. And it's been estimated that about 30% of the tuna that is consumed in Europe comes from the equatorial Atlantic. So trying to understand the processes by which this very valuable protein from the sea is contributing to human food security is important. And it is important to understand how this might be changing over time, especially due to climate change processes. So the objective of that particular expedition was to try and understand what contributes to the productivity of the equatorial Atlantic so that we can understand how that base of the food web will change. But phytoplankton do more than just provide food, basically provide food, more than just the base of the food web. Phytoplankton have been, from the origin of Earth, been responsible for life on Earth. And here what I mean is that by doing photosynthesis, they're basically taking up carbon dioxide and putting out oxygen. So the great oxidation event that basically made this Earth, put oxygen in the atmosphere, made this Earth habitable, was because you had photosynthetic cyanobacteria, which are the oldest organisms that basically did photosynthesis. Now, more specifically for us, by doing photosynthesis that is taking up CO2, they also control climate. In other words, they're also controlling the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and therefore how hot Earth gets. And over millennia or hundreds of millions of years, paleoceanographers have studied this and have noticed that every time you have an increase in productivity of phytoplankton, your Earth cools down. And every time the Earth warms up, it's associated with a decrease in productivity of phytoplankton. So on a global basis, these single cell plants that you cannot see with your eye basically form the basis by which we live on this Earth, right? So my research essentially is trying to understand where these phytoplankton are, who they are, because different types of phytoplankton have different pathways by which they either provide food or take up CO2. And so we want to understand who they are, how much they are. You can almost think of me in some fashion as a couch psychologist for a phytoplankton, asking very existential questions. Who am I? What am I doing here? What happens to me when I die? Because that's essentially the kinds of things we're interested in. Who are the phytoplankton? What happens to them when they die? Do they sink to the seafloor? Do they get eaten? So on and so forth. So this is the fundamental basis of the research that I do. But people like me, observational oceanographers, are interested in understanding the ocean at from several different angles. So you have physical oceanographers who are trying to understand, for example, how much heat oceans can take up. Oceans take up much of the heat that is now being trapped as greenhouse gas. And we are sort of concerned that there may be a time, now they're taking up the heat and it's getting distributed into the ocean, but there may be a limit to the capacity for the ocean to take up heat. And when that tipping point is reached, then we could have catastrophic impacts. But also you have to remember that as the oceans are taking up heat, we also have associated phenomena that you might be quite familiar with, such as raise in sea level, because you have melting of ice from the polar regions. So you have those kinds of effects. But you also have other effects that have not been seriously discussed thus far, but we are now getting more and more insights into, which is marine heat waves. Just like you have heat waves on land, you have heat waves in the water. And so there is a big concern as to what the impact of these heat waves are going to be.
We have all heard about the dangers of rising seas. What are the lesser-known impacts of climate change on the oceans that we should worry about?
On a geophysical scale, the well-known one is about rise in sea level and flooding of coastal areas. But then you also have a physical oceanography angle, which is warming of the oceans. And the question is whether there's going to be a tipping point at which the oceans cannot absorb any more heat, and therefore they will stop absorbing heat, in which case the land is going to warm up much faster because the oceans are taking up heat all the time now. There's a chemical angle. Just as the oceans are taking up heat, the oceans are also taking up carbon dioxide. And therefore, what this means is that there is this phenomenon called ocean acidification. That is, the oceans are becoming less basic, which means that organisms that form shells, such as corals, for example, or shellfish of any kind, will have a harder time making those shells when the oceans become less basic or more acidic. And therefore, there's a whole influence on the biology of the oceans, which comes from this phenomenon of ocean acidification, which is because the oceans are taking up carbon dioxide. At some point, that is going to have catastrophic effects. The third one is just the impact of the heat stress itself on life in the ocean. So we are now starting to recognize that marine heat waves have become a really significant problem. And they have an influence, they basically impact the life and the marine life, the marine ecosystem.
Tell us about advances in our ability to observe the ocean and expand our understanding of how marine ecosystems work. Do all oceanographers conduct months-long expeditions across the seas?
The first robotic profilers, they call them floats, but they're actually instruments that go from the surface of the ocean all the way down to 2,000 meters below the ocean surface and come back up to the surface, making measurements every 10 days. In the beginning, the measurements they were making were of temperature and salinity, that is the salt content of the water. This will basically also tell us how stable the water is. That is, you have light water sitting on top of heavy water, but if for any reason there's a lot of mixing, that will basically get inverted. And so these kinds of measurements also tell us how stable the water is. This is also telling us how much heat is getting absorbed in the ocean because you're making measurements of temperature. These robotic profilers have been now deployed everywhere in the ocean. There are about 6,000 of them that are going up and down, drifting with the ocean currents, but providing us these detailed information on the ocean temperature and salt content. More recently, in the last about 15 years or so, we've also added other sensors to these robotic platforms. So I basically bought my first float, a Apex float. The float was called Bobo, and it was the first float that we put in the Gulf of Mexico back in 2008. And this is a float that had additional sensors that gave us concentrations of phytoplankton, that single-cell plant I was talking about, as well as particles in the water. We have since deployed these floats in the Amazon River outflow to try and understand how the freshwater that's coming out of the Amazon River is changing the phytoplankton composition in the Western tropical Atlantic. And more recently, there have been serious investments by many countries to put out hundreds of these floats in the ocean. And we are now seeing a completely different view of an ocean that before we could only study through ships that went from one point to another. And these floats are just the beginning. Now we have other autonomous platforms called gliders that are also providing us views of the ocean. And the future, in some fashion, of oceanography is going to be the use of these autonomous platforms that are potentially guided by artificial intelligence that will allow us to observe the ocean in ways that we couldn't do from just 5 different ships going somewhere in the ocean and making a measurement every few hours. So I believe we are at the cusp of a real revolution in our ability to observe the ocean. India has been a very strong proponent of putting these autonomous platforms in the waters around India, as well as maintaining a series of moorings. So these are essentially platforms that are anchored to the seafloor, but you have wires that come all the way from 4,000 meters below the seafloor to the surface with instruments that are strung up along these wires. And there's a series of moorings along the equator called the Rama array, which have been making these measurements that are really critical for being able to predict, for example, the strength of the monsoon, when the monsoon will happen and how strong it'll be. These kinds of measurements are really important for the models that meteorologists and oceanographers use to both predict the state of the ocean and predict how things like monsoon strength.
What would you say are the big advances in oceanographic research that give you hope?
We also need to come up with other strategies that will reduce the carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that will, sort of give us time to implement more long-lasting solutions. And so one of these strategies is called carbon dioxide removal, or in the case of oceans, marine carbon dioxide removal. The acronym we use is MCDR, marine carbon dioxide removal. And MCDR is a really key part of the steps we can take to mitigate against or to reduce greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Oceans cover, like I said, 70% of the Earth's surface, and therefore MCDR is essential for that. And people have been trying different techniques. I personally am trying to figure out if a nature-based solution is one way in which we can do this. And what I mean by nature-based solution is that in the tropical Atlantic, we've basically seen a new phenomenon where there's a whole new population of a seaweed that is normally found in the Sargasso Sea. The organism is called sargassum, that has moved into the tropical region. And this is really causing a major problem to the small islands of the Caribbean, where you can have tons of this material wash up on the beaches. Many of these islands are major tourist destinations, and therefore, when the beaches basically are covered with this organism, they stink when they rot. I mean, that's a major problem. They release methane when they rot, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. And the removal of these organisms also ends up destroying the marine environment, the coastal zone of these islands. So one of the methods that we've been trying to figure out is whether we can sink the sargassum offshore before they wash up on the islands in water depths greater than 2,000 meters, and thereby basically solving a series of problems. One is you prevent them from washing up on the beach, and therefore you reduce the economic damage from tourists not coming to the island. Two, by sinking this sargassum down to depths greater than 2,000 meters, all the biomass that is associated with it, which has carbon in it, has basically come about by carbon photosynthesis, which is essentially taking out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. By sinking it down to the seafloor, you're basically taking it out of circulation for about 200 to 300 years. So this is one method of MCDR that could potentially help in moving forward. Now, there are many other methods that we can and we should be considering very seriously. One of them is called a catch-all name of blue carbon, and this is mostly has to do with preserving and conserving carbon in coastal zones. So mangroves, seagrass on the coastal zone, or submerged aquatic vegetation along the coastal zone, all basically are of photosynthetic plants, trees, and preserving them is one way in which you can actually capture carbon and keep it stored. So one of the issues that we have to take very seriously is anything that destroys mangroves, that is going to reduce the amount of seagrass or reduce the amount of submerged aquatic vegetation, you're basically reducing your ability to capture carbon. So there are many steps that can be taken that people are studying, where we are either reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that's getting emitted to the atmosphere because you've taken a plant away, or just as you're planting trees on land, you're planting mangroves, you're planting seagrass, and that also has multiple effects. So by having a mangrove, you're also reducing the effects due to storms, because mangroves will then protect the land from erosion and things like that. So many of these nature-based solutions have multiple additional effects that would be of value. And these are all steps that we should be taking, people are taking, and should be taken seriously. I believe, for me, these are the things that give me hope, which is that I think we have slowly come to realize the crisis, the threat to humanity that climate crisis is presenting. We are starting to take these steps seriously. And I think that if we take enough, if we actually go through with this seriously, then we might be able to prevent greater harm than we would be subject to if we do nothing. For example, with MCDR, the marine carbon dioxide removal, right? There's actually a big market for it. I mean, people are paying money. At this point, there's an estimate there are a few $1 billion that is locked into this idea of capturing carbon and storing it. In some places, each time you purchase something, someone is going to donate a few cents to go plant a tree somewhere. But the problem with many of these carbon removal methods, be it on land or in the ocean, is we need to know that it works. One of the major innovations that is really essential now is low-cost sensors that we can put on these platforms. We have thousands of platforms, but if in the end the sensor costs more than the platform, we are still constrained in how many we can put out in the ocean. So I think that one place where that is really ripe for innovation and where India can play a really major role is in the development of low-cost platforms. India has both the engineering skill and the science skill that is necessary to do this. And it's almost uniquely positioned because of those strengths that India has. And so one area that I would like to explore going forward is to form collaborations with scientists and engineers in India who are interested in this topic to be able to develop new low-cost platforms that will then have a major market in these thousands of robotic platforms that we are trying to put out there.